The day I walked into that clinic with a folder full of lab results, billing statements, and a second opinion from a doctor who actually listened, I watched a man who had spent years dismissing me finally understand that the room he thought he controlled had turned against him. But let me back up, because this story does not start with a dramatic confrontation. It starts with a waiting room, a number on a pager, and a feeling in my body that I had learned to stop trusting. I was 38 years old the first time I sat in Dr. Hartman's waiting room. The chairs were cream-coloured leather, the kind that squeaks when you shift your weight, which I did often because sitting still for long periods made my lower back ache in a way that felt wrong. Not like muscle soreness, but like something pressing from the inside. The room smelled like a hotel lobby. That neutral, slightly chemical scent that tries very hard to communicate cleanliness without admitting it's covering something. There was a small waterfall feature on the reception desk. It made a sound like someone leaving a tap running. I remember thinking that was an odd choice for a place where people came because something was wrong with them. I had been referred to Dr. Hartman by my general practitioner after nearly 2 years of appointments that went nowhere. Fatigue that did not respond to sleep. Joint pain that moved around my body like a slow fire. Settling in my knees 1 week, my wrists the next, then my shoulders, then disappearing for a month before returning without warning. A rash that came and went on my forearms, and once, briefly, across my cheekbones, which my GP attributed to stress, and, at one point, to a soap I had been using for 11 years without incident. My blood work came back, as they say, unremarkable. My GP was kind and genuinely stumped. She referred me upward. Dr. Hartman was the kind of specialist whose waiting room tells you exactly what kind of doctor he is before you ever meet him. The diplomas on the wall were not just framed, they were lit. Soft, warm spotlights angled to catch the gold embossing on the certificates. There was a brochure stand near the door, offering information about what the clinic called wellness, optimization packages, eye vitamin infusions, personalized supplement protocols, cellular regeneration therapies. The brochures were glossy and thick, the paper stock heavier than most medical documents I had ever handled. I picked one up while I waited. The packages started at €400 and climbed steeply from there. When my number was called, I followed a nurse down a corridor lined with more framed certificates and a single large photograph of Dr. Hartman at what appeared to be a charity gala, shaking hands with someone I did not recognize, but who was clearly meant to signal importance. The examination room was bright and cold. The paper on the examination table crinkled when I sat on it. I had brought a written summary of my symptoms, 2 years of notes, dates, durations, severity ratings on a scale I had made up myself because no one had given me a better tool. I had printed it out and stapled it. 4 pages. Dr. Hartman came in 8 minutes later. He was in his mid-50s, tall, with silver hair that looked deliberately maintained, and the kind of confident posture that comes either from genuine authority or from decades of performing it. He shook my hand firmly, glanced at my file, and then looked at me with an expression I would come to recognize as his default setting. Attentive enough to seem engaged, distant enough to stay in control. I handed him my 4 pages. He accepted them the way you accept a flyer from someone on the street, with a polite nod and no intention of reading them. He set them on the desk beside him, face down. He asked me to describe my symptoms in my own words. I did. I was precise. I mentioned the fatigue, the migratory joint pain, the rash, the episodes of brain fog that made it difficult to concentrate at work, the low-grade fever that appeared occasionally in the afternoons. I mentioned the timeline. I mentioned that I had tracked everything. He listened with his arms crossed, nodding at intervals that felt calibrated rather than spontaneous. When I finished, he said, in a tone that was warm but carried a faint note of finality, that what I was describing sounded very much like the effects of modern life. Stress, poor sleep architecture, possibly some nutritional deficiencies. He said the body was remarkably good at generating symptoms that felt serious, but were, in most cases, a response to lifestyle rather than pathology. I asked about the rash on my cheekbones. He said it was consistent with rosacea or a mild allergic response. I mentioned that it had appeared in a pattern that seemed to follow the bridge of my nose. He smiled and said that the internet had made very creative diagnosticians of us all. Then he turned to his computer and began typing. He told me he wanted to run some basic panels, which my GP had already run, and he also wanted to recommend what he called a foundational wellness assessment, which would include a micronutrient analysis, an oxidative stress panel, and an introductory IV infusion session to support my immune system. While we investigated further, he slid a printed sheet across the desk. The foundational wellness assessment was €680, not covered by standard insurance. I looked at the sheet. I looked at him. I said I would think about it. He said, with that same warm finality, that he understood, but that in his experience, patients who invested in understanding their bodies at a foundational level tended to see results much faster than those who waited for symptoms to become undeniable. I left with a referral for the basic blood work, a brochure about the IV infusions, and the quiet, uncomfortable feeling that I had just been sold something without quite knowing what it was. I came back 2 weeks later for the results. The basic blood work was, again, unremarkable. Dr. Hartman reiterated his recommendation for the wellness package. I said I had done some reading and wanted to ask specifically about autoimmune markers, about ANA titers, about anti-ASDNA antibodies, about complement levels. I had been reading, not to diagnose myself, but because the pattern of my symptoms had pointed me in a direction that felt worth asking about. He looked at me for a moment with an expression that shifted almost imperceptibly from professional warmth to something cooler. Then he said it. Not to me directly, but in a tone clearly meant for me to hear, as if he were musing aloud to the room that Google had not yet found a way to turn a search history into a medical degree. He said it lightly, almost amiably, the way someone says a thing they have said many times before and found reliably effective at closing a line of inquiry. I did not respond. I sat very still. I noted the words, I noted the tone, I noted the way he had picked up his pen again and returned his attention to his computer screen, as if the matter was settled. I paid for the appointment. I took the brochure he offered about the cellular regeneration package, which he said might be particularly relevant given my reported fatigue. I said thank you. I walked out through the cream leather waiting room, past the running water feature, on the reception desk. And I sat in my car in the parking garage for about 4 minutes without starting the engine. Then I drove home and made an appointment with a second doctor. The second doctor was not impressive in the way Dr. Hartman was impressive. Her office was in a quieter part of the city, on the second floor of a building that also housed a tax consulting firm and a small physiotherapy practice. Her waiting room had stackable plastic chairs and a children's corner with a box of Duplo bricks and a picture book about a caterpillar. There were no brochures about wellness optimization. There was a poster on the wall about hand hygiene and one about recognizing the signs of a stroke. She was younger than Dr. Hartman, maybe 40, with reading glasses that she wore on top of her head and dropped onto her nose when she looked at something closely. She read my 4 pages, all of them. She asked me follow-up questions. She asked me to describe the rash again, and specifically asked whether it was worse after sun exposure. I said yes. She asked whether I had ever experienced mouth sores. I said yes. Occasionally, I had assumed they were stress-related. She asked about hair loss. I said I had noticed more hair in the shower drain over the past year, but had attributed it to age. She ordered a specific panel, ANA titer, anti-dsDNA, complement C3 and C4, urinalysis with microscopy, CBC with differential, complete metabolic panel. She also ordered a skin biopsy of the area where the rash had last appeared, which was still faintly visible on my left forearm. She said she was not making any diagnosis yet. She said she wanted to rule things in or out based on evidence rather than assumptions. She said my symptoms were not unremarkable. She said that phrase, not unremarkable, with a quiet emphasis that landed differently than anything Dr. Hartman had said to me in 6 months of appointments. 3 weeks later, I had a diagnosis: systemic lupus erythematosus, SLE, an autoimmune condition in which the immune system attacks the body's own tissues. Chronic, manageable with proper treatment, potentially serious if left unaddressed. The migratory joint pain, the fatigue, the malar rash across the bridge of my nose and cheeks, the brain fog, the occasional low-grade fever, The mouth sores I had mentioned to no one because they seemed too minor to bring up. All of it had a name, all of it had a mechanism, all of it had a treatment pathway. I sat with that for a while. I want to be honest about what that felt like. It was not simple relief. It was relief and grief and anger arriving at the same time, occupying the same moment, which is a disorienting combination. Relief because I had not been imagining it. Grief because 2 years is a long time to be in a body that is quietly fighting itself, while everyone around you suggests you need less screen time and more vitamin D. Anger because of the €680 foundational wellness assessment brochure that was still, I realised, sitting in the passenger seat of my car. I drove home. I did not do anything impulsive. I want to be clear about that. I did not call Dr. Hartman. I did not post anything online. I did not call the clinic and demand an explanation. I went home, I made tea, and I sat at my kitchen table with a folder I had been keeping, almost without realising I was keeping it, since my second appointment with Dr. Hartman. The folder contained every receipt from the clinic, every printed summary he had given me, the 2 brochures I had taken, the foundational wellness assessment sheet with the pricing, and the cellular regeneration package overview. My own 4-page symptom summary, which I had retrieved from his desk when he stepped out briefly during my second appointment, because I had noticed he had not filed it anywhere, and I wanted it back. My notes from every appointment, written in the car immediately afterward, while the details were still fresh. And now the results from the second doctor's panel and her written referral to a rheumatologist and a letter explaining her clinical reasoning, I added to the folder over the following weeks. I requested my complete patient file from Dr. Hartman's clinic, which I was entitled to under applicable patient rights regulations. The file confirmed that he had never ordered the specific autoimmune markers I had asked about. It confirmed that his documented clinical assessment had attributed my symptoms to lifestyle factors and stress. It confirmed that he had recommended, and on one occasion, partially administered, a vitamin infusion session, for which I had paid €220 during a visit I had not fully documented in my own notes. A visit where I had been tired and in pain and had agreed to something I did not fully understand because he had presented it as a preliminary step toward more comprehensive testing that never came. €220. I held that receipt for a long time. I also requested an itemised breakdown of every charge from the clinic over the 18 months I had been a patient there. The total across all visits, the infusion, the packages I had partially purchased, and the consultations themselves came to just over €2,400. Of that, approximately €600 had been covered by my supplementary insurance. The rest I had paid out of pocket for the privilege of being told that Google did not make doctors. I want to describe something about that period, the weeks between getting my diagnosis and deciding what to do next, because I think it is important to the shape of this story. I was not plotting. I was processing. I was starting treatment with the rheumatologist my second doctor had referred me to, a careful, methodical man who explained every decision he made and asked my opinion before proceeding. I was learning what lupus meant for my life. I was having difficult conversations with people I was close to. I was also slowly and deliberately deciding that what had happened to me was not just a personal misfortune, it was a pattern, and patterns have consequences. I found out that Dr. Hartman's clinic had a formal complaints process, as all registered medical practices in the region were required to. I also found out that the Regional Medical Association had a patient ombudsman office, and that the clinic itself was affiliated with a larger hospital network that had its own internal review committee, a body that met quarterly to assess complaints against affiliated practitioners. The committee was not a court. It had no power to revoke licenses, but it had the power to recommend disciplinary review, to flag practitioners to the licensing board, to require remedial training, and, crucially, to affect the clinic's standing within the hospital network, which determined whether the clinic could continue to offer its services under the network's accreditation and whether it could continue billing certain procedures to supplementary insurance providers. The clinic's wellness packages, I had learned from a brief conversation with an insurance consultant I knew professionally, occupied a legally interesting grey zone. They were not standard medical treatments. They were classified as individual health services, which meant patients paid for them privately. But for a clinic to market them under the umbrella of a hospital-affiliated practice and to present them to patients as part of a diagnostic or treatment pathway, rather than as optional lifestyle products, raise questions about informed consent and about the ethical separation between medical advice and commercial upselling. I am not a lawyer. I am not a medical professional. I am a person who had been sick for 2 years and dismissed for 2 years and charged for 2 years for products that had nothing to do with finding out what was wrong with me. I put my folder together. I wrote a formal complaint. I kept it factual, specific, and documented. I attached the billing records. I attached the patient file I had requested. I attached the second doctor's clinical notes and her explanation of why she had ordered the tests Dr. Hartman had declined to order. I attached the diagnosis. I attached a written account of the specific appointment during which Dr. Hartman had made the comment about Google and medical degrees, including the date, the context, and the precise wording as I had recorded it in my car immediately afterward. I submitted the complaint to the clinic's internal process, to the hospital network's review committee, and to the Regional Medical Association's patient ombudsman simultaneously. Then I waited. The clinic responded first. A letter from the administrative director, professionally worded, expressing regret for my experience and noting that Dr. Hartman was a highly regarded specialist with an excellent record and that the clinic took patient concerns seriously. It offered me a complimentary consultation to discuss my concerns in person. It did not address any of the specific documented points in my complaint. It was the letter equivalent of the waterfall feature in the waiting room, designed to create a feeling without providing anything of substance. I replied in writing, acknowledging receipt, declining the complimentary consultation, and noting that I had submitted the complaint simultaneously to the hospital network committee and the ombudsman, and that I considered the clinic's internal process to be running in parallel rather than superseding the external reviews. I was polite. I was precise. I used the word simultaneously twice. The hospital network's review committee acknowledged my complaint within 10 days and informed me that it would be reviewed at the next quarterly meeting, which was 6 weeks away. They asked whether I would be willing to present my case in person. I said yes. I want to tell you about the day of that committee meeting, because it is the part of this story that I have replayed most often, not with satisfaction exactly, but with the specific, quiet feeling of a thing finally being seen. The meeting room was on the 4th floor of the hospital network's administrative building. It was a conference room, the institutional kind, with a long table, stackable chairs, and a projector that someone had set up but that no one ended up using. There were 7 people on the committee, 2 senior physicians from other departments in the network, 2 patient advocates, 1 administrator, 1 legal representative from the hospital network, and 1 external medical ethics consultant. They had received my documentation in advance. They had also, I learned when I arrived, received a written response from Dr. Hartman, which I had not seen. Dr. Hartman was present. I had not known he would be. I want to be honest. When I walked in and saw him sitting at the far end of the table in a suit that was noticeably better than anything else in the room, I felt a physical response, not fear, something older and more complicated. The particular discomfort of being in the same space as someone who had made you feel small and who does not yet know that the room has changed. He looked at me when I came in. He nodded. A brief, professional nod, the kind that says, "I acknowledge your presence and nothing more." I nodded back. I set my folder on the table in front of me. It was the same folder I'd been building for months. It was thick. He glanced at it. I noticed the glance. The committee chair introduced everyone, explained the process, and invited me to present my case. I had prepared a summary. I spoke for approximately 12 minutes. I did not raise my voice. I did not editorialize. I described the timeline of my symptoms, the appointments with Dr. Hartman, the specific clinical decisions he had made and not made, the commercial recommendations and their costs, the appointment during which he had made the comment about Google and medical degrees, and the subsequent second opinion that had resulted in a diagnosis of systemic lupus erythematosus within 3 weeks of the first appointment. I placed copies of the relevant documents in front of each committee member as I spoke. The billing records, the patient file, the second doctor's notes, the diagnosis, the itemised cost breakdown. When I finished, the committee chair thanked me and turned to Dr. Hartman. Dr. Hartman's response began confidently. He said that my case had been clinically complex, that my initial blood work had not indicated autoimmune pathology, that the decision to recommend lifestyle modifications and nutritional support was consistent with a conservative, patient-centered approach. He said that he deeply regretted that I had not felt heard, a phrase that is doing a great deal of work when the alternative would be to say that he had failed to hear me. He said that the wellness packages offered by his clinic were clearly presented as optional and that patients were never pressured to purchase them. One of the patient advocates asked him to clarify what he meant by clearly presented. She asked whether patients were given written information about the optional nature of the packages before they were recommended. There was a pause. Dr. Hartman said that the brochures were available in the waiting room and that his staff explained the packages during consultations. The patient advocate said she had reviewed the brochure I had submitted and noted that it did not include any language indicating that the packages were not part of standard diagnostic care. She asked whether there was a separate consent form or information sheet that made this distinction explicit. There was another pause. Dr. Hartman said he believed the clinic's intake documentation covered this. The legal representative from the hospital network asked whether he could provide that documentation. Dr. Hartman said he would need to check with his administrative team. The external ethics consultant asked about the specific comment I had attributed to Dr. Hartman regarding internet research and medical qualifications. He asked whether Dr. Hartman recalled making such a comment. Dr. Hartman said he could not recall the specific wording, but acknowledged that he sometimes made general remarks about the limitations of self-diagnosis, which he considered part of managing patient expectations responsibly. The ethics consultant said, carefully and without particular emphasis, that there was a meaningful difference between educating a patient about the limitations of self-diagnosis and dismissing a patient's research-informed questions in a manner that could discourage them from seeking additional opinions. He said this in a tone that was not hostile. It was the tone of someone stating something true. Dr. Hartman said he understood the distinction. The committee chair asked me whether I had anything to add. I said I had one thing. I said that I was not there to end Dr. Hartman's career. I said that I was there because I had spent 2 years being told that my symptoms were a product of modern life, that I had been charged over €2,000 for services that had no bearing on my actual condition, and that a relatively straightforward diagnostic process had identified a chronic autoimmune condition that was now being managed effectively. I said that I hoped the committee would consider not only my individual case, but the structural conditions that had made it possible. A practice model in which commercial wellness services were integrated into a diagnostic consultation in a way that created a conflict of interest between the physician's clinical obligations and the practice's revenue. I set the folder on the table. I did not take it back with me when I left. I had copies of everything. I did not hear the outcome of Dr. Hartman's response to the committee in that room. The committee deliberated privately. I received their written findings 6 weeks later. The findings were careful and institutional in their language, as such documents always are. They noted that the evidence submitted raised credible concerns about the integration of commercial wellness services into the clinical consultation process at Dr. Hartman's practice. They noted that the absence of clear written consent documentation distinguishing optional wellness packages from standard medical care was inconsistent with the hospital network's accreditation standards for affiliated practices. They recommended that the clinic undertake an immediate review of its patient information and consent procedures for all non-standard services. They recommended that the case be referred to the Regional Medical Association's Ethics Board for review of Dr. Hartman's clinical decision-making in relation to my case specifically. And they noted that the clinic's affiliation status with the hospital network would be subject to reassessment, pending the outcome of the Ethics Board review and the clinic's compliance with the recommended procedural changes. Affiliation status. That phrase mattered more than it might sound. The affiliation with the hospital network was what allowed the clinic to market its services with the implicit backing of an established medical institution. It was what gave the wellness packages their air of medical legitimacy. It was what allowed certain services to be billed to supplementary insurance providers under the network's accreditation. Without that affiliation, the clinic was a private wellness centre with very nice brochures and a waterfall feature in the lobby. I learned, some months later, through a person I knew who worked in a different department of the hospital network, that the clinic had suspended its wellness package offerings pending the review. I learned that Dr. Hartman had been required to undergo a formal ethics consultation and that the review of his clinical decision-making, in my case, had resulted in a finding of insufficient clinical rigour in the diagnostic process. I do not know the full extent of what followed. I do not need to. I know that a man who had spent years operating in a room he believed he fully controlled had stood in a different room and been asked questions he could not answer smoothly. I know that the certainty he had worn like a second suit had in that room become something he had to manage rather than something he could simply project. I know that he said Google did not make doctors, and then a folder full of documents built by a person he had dismissed proved that he had failed to do what a doctor is supposed to do. That is enough. I want to tell you about the morning I went to my third appointment with my rheumatologist, because it is where this story actually ends for me.
Not in a committee room, not in a parking garage, but in an ordinary examination room, with a man who pulled up my chart, asked me how I had been sleeping, and listened to the answer. My medication had been adjusted twice since I started treatment.
The joint pain had reduced significantly. The fatigue was still present, but had shifted from a constant, pressing weight to something more manageable, something that responded to rest. The rash had not appeared in 11 weeks. I was learning the difference between a flare and a bad day, which are different things that require different responses. I was learning to pay attention to my body without catastrophizing, which is a skill I had to rebuild from scratch after 2 years of being taught to distrust my own observations. My rheumatologist asked whether I had any questions. I had brought a list, as I always did now. He read through it. He answered each question directly. He said he did not know the answer to one of them and would look into it before our next appointment. He said that sentence without any apparent discomfort. I do not know the answer to that. I will look into it. I have thought about how simple that sentence is and how rarely I had heard it in Dr. Hartman's consultation room. On my way out, I passed the reception desk and stopped for a moment. The receptionist asked if I needed anything. I said no, I was just thinking. She smiled and said to take my time. I had the copy of the folder with me, the one I had kept for myself. I had carried it to every appointment since the committee meeting, not because I needed it anymore, but because it had become something I was not ready to put down. It represented, in a physical way, the difference between being a person things happen to and being a person who pays attention, builds a record, and eventually places that record somewhere it cannot be ignored. I walked to my car. I put the folder in the back seat, the same back seat where the wellness brochure had once sat in the passenger seat on the drive home from that first appointment. I sat for a moment, not 4 minutes this time, maybe 1. Then I drove home. I want to say something to anyone who has ever sat in a waiting room with a printed summary of their symptoms and had those symptoms set aside, face down, without being read. I want to say something to anyone who has been told, in whatever tone, that their concern is a product of too much internet use, too much stress, too little patience with the ordinary discomforts of living. I want to say something to anyone who has paid for a service that was dressed up as care and was actually dressed up as revenue. You are not required to be unremarkable. Your symptoms are not a personality flaw. The fact that a test came back normal does not mean you are fine. It may mean the wrong test was ordered. Get a second opinion. Keep your receipts. Write down what was said to you in the car immediately afterward. While the words are still exact, build the folder. You may never need it. I hope you never need it. But if the day comes when you walk into a room and need to place something on a table that cannot be ignored, you will want to have it. I was sick for 2 years before anyone found out why. I was dismissed for 2 years before I stopped allowing it. I spent 2 years being told that my body's signals were noise. They were not noise, they were information. And eventually, I found someone who knew the difference. The folder is still in the back seat of my car. Some days, I think I should file it away properly, close the chapter, let it become archive rather than armor. Some days I think keeping it there is a kind of promise I made to myself. The promise that I will not again sit quietly in a cream leather chair while a man with lit diplomas on his wall tells me with a warm and final smile that what I am feeling is not worth investigating. I'm not angry anymore. That is not performance. The anger did its job. It kept me precise when I could have been scattered, kept me building the folder when I could have been venting online, kept me walking into that committee room when part of me would have preferred to simply leave and never think about Dr. Hartman again. But anger is not where I live now. I live in the quiet, specific satisfaction of a body that is being treated for what it actually has. I live in appointments where my questions are answered. I live in the knowledge that I did not let myself be made small, not permanently, not in any way that stuck. That is the whole story. The folder. The folder is the whole story. A man dismissed what was in it before it existed. A committee read every page. And I drove home,